Hi, welcome to my video on output analysis and how that connects to supply. Now what we want to do in this video is talk about really how supply in the market is developed. But again, we're going to begin with cost of production because that's where it starts. Now, be an active learner. Take some notes. As I write on the board, you write as well. That will help you remember the content better, as well as give you a reference to go back and take a look, especially if you have to answer some questions. All right, so what is this idea of supply? We'll get to that, but let's start with cost of production. Now, we've got another video on that, but I want to bring that over to this side a little bit, and I'm going to build some information, a review of cost analysis. So you'll want to build that as a section in your notes. I'm going to write across this way, but you might want to go top to bottom in your notes. All right, well, cost of production is where we learned a little bit about something called average, and I'm going to spell it out, fixed cost, but that really is average fixed cost like that, AFC. Now, average fixed cost really just went down as we produce more. It really kind of shared with us economies of scale, meaning that as we produce more, the fixed cost per unit, the average, drops. And that's what we learned from that. Another thing that we learned in our output analysis and cost analysis is the average, and I'm going to abbreviate that a little bit, variable cost. Again, that's AVC. And that is where we learned a little bit about how efficient we are at using inputs. So what's the difference between these two? Quickly, fixed costs are things like depreciation, rent payments on land, buildings, maybe management salary. If we produce zero, we still have these. If we don't produce at all, then variable costs, things like feed, veterinary medicine and care of livestock, labor out there in the fields working, tractor time in the fields, those kind of expenses we just wouldn't have because nothing would be happening. No production's happening out there. Average fixed costs, though, we learned a very important part, and that is that it tells us the minimum price. Because if we are going to go out there and produce, we've got to cover that cost. So each unit, average variable cost, gives you your minimum price. Got to cover that. Fixed costs, need to cover it, but it's sunk. It doesn't matter to us as much. That's the one we've got to cover. Well, if you add these two things together, then you got average total cost. Again, that's ATC. And average total cost gave us, of course, it's these two things added together. It gave us a very important number to know about, and that is your break-even price. Now, the break-even is because I've got to cover fixed and variable to get total. That's the minimum I can take, but I would rather get this, or actually I'd rather get above that so I can make a profit. But these are the output areas, cost analysis that we've gone over, and they help tell the story about supply. We'll get there again in a bit. All right, what's another thing that we learned out of our cost analysis is that really this whole thing is handy to look at in a marginal standpoint, marginal cost, and what we did was we matched it to the price. So marginal revenue is the price. When these two things are equal, that is when you get the best profit that you can achieve. So our output analysis tried to kind of help us deal with some cost and where we make money and where we need to try to get to make money. What's the minimum we would take? How efficient are we getting with fixed cost? Things like our buildings and our equipment. We got to produce a lot to get that handled. So these things are all really combined to tell you about profit. And so profit is the focus of all of this. And in fact, profit is why supply even happens. In fact, if you didn't have profit or some minimum price where you produce at a loss, but you still do it, these things have to be dealt with. Otherwise, we won't understand profit and we won't know how to make a profit. And if we can't make a profit, we're not sustainable as a business, we won't be able to supply. So it's kind of a tricky situation. I need to understand all this. I want to maximize profit, but the market is going to give me a price or try to frame for me a price, and I need to get produced within that to hopefully make a profit. If I can, now I have the ability to get to what we're going to talk about in a bit, and that is supply. All right, so let's go ahead and jump to supply. In fact, I'm going to take these variables and I want to graph them. Now, we've talked about a market in our introductory video, but the easiest way for me to talk about a market is to draw a picture. So move down in your notes, but I'm going to come over here on this side of my board, and I am going to draw a line for my y-axis and my x-axis. A little bit small here, but this is the dollar values on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, it is a quantity that I would produce. So if I produce zero quantity, I likely have a zero cost, but that's not true. You would actually have a giant cost up here, and that cost would start off to be average fixed cost, because you've got to pay that. So average fixed cost is going to actually, though, as I produce, just get lower and lower and lower. It's going to start flattening out here at the end, and that is average fixed cost. So draw a dot way up high up here, a big dollar cost up there. And then as you start producing, it just drops and drops and drops and drops and gets really cheap. It starts flattening out here at the end because it's just going to keep getting smaller and smaller. All right, that's average fixed cost. That's an easy way to illustrate what that looks like. Average variable cost, it doesn't start off as high because if you produce nothing, you have no average variable cost. But if you do start to produce just a little bit, then you're going to end up with, and I'm going to draw it up here somewhere about here at the upper part of my graph, you will have a cost. And that cost will drop down at first because we're getting real efficient at things like feed and vet medicine, and we're getting more and more production out of it. So we're really doing good on a cost standpoint. It's dropping here, right? See the cost going down? But as I continue across here, it kind of flattens out. And then it actually starts to go up. And so that is what average variable cost does. There is a point when it drops, and you may say, well, that's where you want to make your most money. However, when you look at that quantity is low. You still could get way out here, and you could make even more overall profit. And so really, these answers are later. All right, average variable and average and fixed come together, and I'm going to draw that plus that, and I'm going to go up here and draw another dot, and then I want to draw average total cost. Now, I understand variable is kind of my minimum, so that's kind of like the lowest I would deal with, but total cost is also important. So I'm going to take variable, fixed, add them together. That's why I put a dot up here. And then as I go across here and produce, average total is going to drop like variable does and like fixed, but average total is going to also kind of mimic this shape, but it's going to get closer to average variable as we go. Now, why do these things get closer as we're way out here? The answer is because fixed cost is just dropping really fast. So another word for fixed cost was sunk cost. Reason why it's called that is it becomes less and less important to us as we produce, and that's kind of a visual illustration of why. Okay, last line on here, I'm going to change colors because it's a real important one for us, and that's marginal cost. What does it look like? Well, to make it simple, I'm going to kind of draw it up here. It's going to be right with average variable at first, so I'm going to go right below average variable. But as our variable cost drops, our fixed costs drop, our total costs drop, marginal cost is measuring the change, and it's going to drop too. In fact, it's going to drop, and it's going to come right down here to the bottom of our average variable, somewhere here, and then it's going to rocket up. And that's called marginal cost. Now, why is it rocketing up? Well, it's rocketing up because variable's going up, total's going up because of variable. Fixed is still dropping, but it's becoming less important to us. And so marginal cost is kind of an area there that I would like to focus on. In fact, I'm going to take another color. You can use your pen or whatever you've got. And in drawing this, I'm going to remember that average variable is my minimum price, right? So I would take any of these dollar costs to deal with as long as I can cover the variable. So I'm going to also, though, realize that marginal cost and marginal revenue, that's your price you get, they are always going to be equal. So I'm going to follow this marginal cost curve because it's the one that's going to connect. And if I just shade it, I'm going to use a different color here to help me explain it. I'm going to shade it all the way up. You actually get a new line, and that is called supply. Because a producer, let's go through the scenario. If I've got a price that's like way up high, like I've got a price, let's take this first dollar amount I put way up here, and let's call that, let me go with the green line here. That's my marginal revenue one, way up high. And if I tick it across here, that's the price. It's going to be the same price. It's $6, it's $5. There's my quantity. Tick it all the way down there. There's the quantity I would produce at marginal revenue one. There's the quantity I'd put on the market. Because this price is going to let me produce a lot. Remember, I have to produce where my marginal cost and my marginal revenue equal. I can't get way out here. Supply, the cost supply won't let me. So I end up at that quantity. It's still really high. If I back down to a lower, I'm going to go right in the middle of my graph here. Marginal revenue 2, that's $1 as well. Much lower. I got to stop right there again at marginal cost, run right down, and sure enough, if you've got a lower price in the market, you can bet people are going to try to produce less. And that is really exactly why marginal cost is, excuse me, the supply curve above average variable. So that's the important answer here. What is market supply? It comes from producers' willingness or ability to produce a profit. Comes over here, gives us all our cost curve looks. But marginal cost is the most important one. And as long as I can cover my average variable, then I would take any price at that level. In fact, if I kind of take that area right there where they meet and draw a little line over, and that's the low marginal revenue, or that's the low market price, because that's what marginal revenue is. That is the lowest market price I would take. So anything up there would be better. The higher, the more I'll produce. The lower, the less I'll produce. And that is supply in the marketplace. Last thing is, what would make supply change? So then, again, drawing down underneath here in your notes, I'm going to put it right here in the middle. What are the factors of supply? What would make this line change? Well, the first thing is the cost of production. So what would cause the cost of production to change? And that would be technology. As our producers in ag are able to get access to new technology and learn new farming techniques, if they can lower their cost, then all of these cost curves drop. When they drop, that means the quantities are, you can achieve higher quantities. And so that allows the marketplace to get more quantity. Of course, as more quantity happens in the supply function, I'm ignoring demand. Now, what's demand all about? It's about taste and preferences and what people want and social influence and numbers of consumers out there that are trying to buy this stuff. I'm not worried about them right now. I'm just talking about what would change supply. And that's going to be very much all our cost. They change all these curves, but they really change marginal cost, which is supply. So what is a factor? And that's cost of production and technology. What's another factor? Another factor is the number of producers. If you've got nobody out there in the marketplace, then you've got very few of these marginal cost supply curves. And if you get more and more and more of them in the market, then you end up with more and more supply. So that would change the number of producers as well. So supply is a function of the market. It's related to the output analysis that producers deal with. And then after you run it all through, it's all about producers trying to make a profit. If they have the ability to make a profit, then that's sustainable. Then they have the ability to supply, and that's going to, the market's going to get the supply from it. But if market prices drop super low and get really low, that's when producers have to shut down, and they'll deal with that as long as they can cover, again, their what? Average variable cost. And it's right there in this graph. And that's why average variable cost is really the bottom. And so any market, any marginal cost or price goes up there, will end up creating the concept that we had to focus on here, and that was supply. All right, remember, that's just half of the market. The rest is demand, but that's a whole other set of factors and influence. Understanding supply is about output analysis, cost of production. Hopefully this visual representation gives you an easier picture to understand why the factors of supply are what they are. Thanks.